Logical fallacies are flaws in reasoning that weaken an argument. They're often used to persuade or even sell without evidence, and they can be quite convincing. Logical fallacies can be confusing and overwhelming. There are about a gazillion of them, and many of them have multiple names and even several sub-fallacies. The good news is that learning to recognize the most common fallacies is a huge step in the right direction, and the skills are transferable. Fallacies each have specific patterns, so if you learn to spot them in one issue, you can see them in others. In this video, we're going to cover 15 of the most common fallacies in alphabetical order. Get these under your belt and you'll be well on your way to spotting misleading arguments. Oh, and stay tuned to the end for a bonus fallacy. Our first fallacy is one of the most common. Latin for to the person, the ad hominem fallacy is a personal attack. Essentially, instead of addressing an argument's substance, they attack the source. The ad hominem can take many forms, from attacking someone's character, to questioning their motives, to accusing them of being a hypocrite. For example, a common technique used to discredit news reporting is to accuse them of being fake news. And many anti-science arguments accuse scientists of being shills, essentially saying they're in it for the money, and therefore their conclusions are wrong. At its core, the ad hominem is a diversion tactic. It's easy to attack a source. It's much harder to address the substance of an argument. Importantly, name-calling and insults aren't ad hominems. They're just rude. It's only fallacious if it's used to discredit an argument. So, you're an idiot isn't an ad hominem. You're an idiot, and therefore you're wrong, is. The appeal to authority fallacy claims that something is true based on the position of an assumed authority. This fallacy can be quite tricky, so it's important to understand when it is and isn't fallacious. Arguments should have evidence, and authorities aren't evidence. But experts aren't authorities. While authorities claim something is true because of their authority, experts base their position on evidence. Therefore, citing actual experts isn't an appeal to authority. Keep in mind, however, that citing experts can only support an argument, not prove it. There are 3 cases when an appeal to authority is fallacious. First, the authority isn't an expert. This is probably the most common form of the fallacy and the easiest to spot. For example, a nurse isn't an expert in vaccines. A senator isn't an expert in climate change, and an actress isn't a skincare expert. This type of appeal to authority is common in advertisements, which often feature celebrities or people dressed in lab coats to appear authoritative. But these supposed authorities aren't experts, so their testimony doesn't hold any weight. Second, the appeal to authority is fallacious when the authority is an expert in another area. The opinion of experts is only relevant within their area of expertise. For example, a heart surgeon isn't an expert in climate change, and a physicist isn't an expert in cancer. An advanced degree does not make someone an expert in all areas, and there will always be someone with an advanced degree who has crackpot ideas. So when an authority makes a claim, it's important to ask whether they are in a position to make such a claim. And third, the appeal to authority is fallacious when the authority makes a claim contrary to the expert consensus. The expert consensus is the collective, agreed-upon knowledge of experts in a specialized field. For non-experts, the consensus is the most reliable form of knowledge. They can be wrong, of course, but the stronger the consensus, the more unlikely it is. For example, if 99 oncologists independently tell me that I have cancer and need treatment, but one disagrees, I'm not going to risk it. This type of appeal to authority is probably the most challenging to spot, as the expert does appear to have legitimate expertise. But there are always going to be contrarians. Therefore, cherry-picking an expert with a minority position to make an argument, while neglecting the expert consensus, is an appeal to authority. The bottom line is, if you're going to cite an authority, they should be an actual expert on the issue, and one who is in line with the expert consensus, or it's an appeal to authority fallacy. The appeal to emotion fallacy uses emotions to persuade in place of evidence. This fallacy can be very effective, as emotions can drive our reasoning often without our awareness. It's important to note that the use of emotions in and of itself isn't fallacious, as they can be relevant to an argument. It's fallacious when emotions are used instead of evidence. This fallacy is a broad category that includes appeals to any number of emotions, from negative emotions like anger, jealousy, fear, pity, shame, hate, and disgust, to positive emotions like happiness, hope, courage, and love. As you might expect, this fallacy is common in ads, politics, and propaganda, as emotions are an easy way to manipulate your reasoning. Recognizing which emotion was used isn't as important as realizing that an argument has substituted logical reasons with emotional ones. The appeal to ignorance fallacy asserts that something is true because we don't know that it isn't. A foundation of critical thinking is that claims require evidence. Claims made without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. A lack of evidence isn't a reason to believe, it simply demonstrates our ignorance. The appeal to ignorance fallacy is commonly used by science deniers, pseudoscience proponents, and conspiracy theorists who point to anomalies as evidence of their beliefs. What was that? A UFO? Bigfoot? A ghost? We don't know that it wasn't, so it must have been. Conversely, it's also an appeal to ignorance to say that something isn't true because we don't know that it is. For example, we don't have evidence that ghosts are real, therefore they aren't. This fallacy can be sneaky, as we're basically using a lack of evidence as cover to support what we want or don't want to believe. A more rational response is to maintain a healthy level of skepticism and demand sufficient evidence before accepting a claim. The point is, claims require evidence. All a lack of evidence shows is our own ignorance. It doesn't provide a reason for believing. Basically, when we don't know, we don't know. The appeal to nature fallacy argues that something is good because it's natural, or bad because it's unnatural. This fallacy is extremely pervasive. It's also extremely effective. Humans have a bias towards believing that natural equals better or safer, which advertisers are keenly aware of. And the result is a plethora of foods, beauty products, supplements, cleaning products, and even pesticides labeled natural in one way or another. But there are two major reasons the appeal to nature is fallacious. First, natural is difficult to define. Many things that are supposedly unnatural come from nature. So when does something stop being natural? Oil is natural, and plastic is made from oil. So is plastic natural? Honestly, the term natural is so vague that it's nearly meaningless. People often use words like chemicals to imply that something is unnatural. But literally everything is made of chemicals. Plus, our bodies recognize molecules, not their sources. To our cells, vitamin C is the same whether it came from an orange or a synthetic supplement. The point is, dividing things into natural and synthetic is often a false choice. Like most things in life, it's not black or white, but shades of gray. Second, we can't assume something is good or safe based on whether it's natural or unnatural. I have bad news. Nature doesn't care if you live. Nature's full of things that will harm you or kill you, from typhoons to toxins to viruses and sharks. Also, human advancements that are considered unnatural, like flushing toilets and vaccines, have greatly improved our quality and quantity of life. The Black Death killed nearly a third of Europe's population, who lacked natural immunity to a natural bacterium. But today, we can treat it, cure it, with synthetic antibiotics. The bottom line is that the appeal to nature is fallacious because we simply cannot determine if something is good or safe based on whether it's perceived to be natural. The appeal to tradition fallacy asserts that something is true or better because it's been around for a long time. We often romanticize the past and we tend to stick with what's familiar, assuming that it's the best way of doing things. Sometimes that's true, but we've also weeded out a lot of bad ideas. For example, the ancients believed the earth was flat and that diseases were caused by witches. Thanks to scientific progress and evidence, we know that germs cause diseases and that bloodletting isn't an effective treatment. Consider astrology and acupuncture. Both may be old, but that alone isn't evidence. In fact, astrology has been disproven, and the evidence suggests that acupuncture is basically a placebo. The appeal to tradition is common in nutrition and alternative medicine. There are ancient harvest foods and traditional supplements and cures. There are even diets that tell you to eat like your ancestors. The appeal to tradition is also commonly used to justify existing cultural or religious practices. It's often said that traditions are peer pressure from dead people. We owe it to ourselves and future generations to rethink some of the ways that we do things. The bottom line is that the appeal to tradition is fallacious because it substitutes good reasons with historical ones. If something truly works, provide the evidence. Ancient wisdom, and this is the way it's always been done, are not sufficient. The bandwagon fallacy, or the appeal to the masses, argues that a claim is true because a lot of people believe it's true. Or, conversely, a claim isn't true because a lot of people don't believe it. Humans are social animals, and it often makes sense to accept what the majority of people believe. But popularity doesn't determine truth. A lot of people can be and have been wrong. The majority used to believe the earth was flat and that the sun revolved around the earth. For example, everyone was speeding, so I shouldn't get a ticket. Or many people believe in ghosts, so they must be real. Advertisers commonly use this fallacy, such as like a fast food chain that claims over 99 billion served, and a makeup brand that says that they're America's favorite. Politicians also appeal to their popularity to try to earn our support. They might say, everybody knows, or many people say or think something. Basically, the bandwagon fallacy is a form of peer pressure. The bottom line is that the truth of a claim isn't determined by its popularity, but by the evidence supporting it. The false cause fallacy asserts that two events are causally connected when they aren't. Let's unpack this a bit. A correlation is when two things or events occur together, whereas causation means a change in one thing directly causes a change in another. But just because two things occur together doesn't mean one caused the other. Sometimes there's something else causing both events, and sometimes it's just a coincidence. It's important to think of other possible explanations and not jump to conclusions. For example, every morning the rooster crows and the sun rises. These two events are correlated, but the rooster doesn't cause the sun to rise. While that may be an obvious example, it's very easy to confuse the two, and if we're not careful, we can easily be fooled. It's human nature to search for explanations by finding patterns and connecting the dots to figure out why something happened. Imagine I ate a sandwich for lunch and threw up later. Did the sandwich cause me to be sick? Could be. But any number of things likely occurred before I got sick that might be the cause. And by limiting myself to the sandwich, I might be missing something important. Maybe I caught a stomach bug. Maybe it was a new medication. Maybe it was an undiagnosed disease. I'm not pregnant. Or maybe it wasn't the sandwich, but the salad. Mistaking correlation for causation is a very common way that we fool ourselves. For example, while we don't fully understand the causes of autism yet, we do know that it's not vaccines. Yet, because many childhood vaccinations are given around the same age that the symptoms of autism first start to appear, it's understandable how parents might put the two together. This fallacy also forms the basis of many superstitions. I wore my lucky socks and hit a home run. Or my fender bender must have happened because it was a Friday the 13th. The point is that just because two things occur together doesn't mean one caused the other. Look for alternative explanations. Evaluate the evidence. Recognize your own biases. And weigh your confidence in your conclusion accordingly. The false choice fallacy oversimplifies a complex issue into two options, ignoring the possibility that there may be other options available. In this fallacy, the arguer frames their opponent's choices as black or white, this or that, when in reality, there's likely a spectrum of choices in between. Black or white thinking is seductive. It's simple, uncomplicated, but reality is many shades of gray. It's nuanced, complex, uncertain. To spot a false choice, look out for the framing of complicated issues into only two options: us or them. Good or evil, safe or unsafe, nature or nurture, pro-choice or pro-life, America, love it or leave it. False choices are often the result of a lack of knowledge and strong emotions, which can lead to overconfidence and even extremism. A false choice essentially shuts down a debate and forces the opponent into the arguer's preferred position. But the false choice is fallacious because the vast majority of the time there are more than two options available. So don't let someone force you into an extreme position. The false equivalence fallacy argues that two or more things are the same despite having important differences. Comparisons can be a powerful way to understand new concepts, but the devil is in the details. While superficial similarities are often easy to see, they may be masking important differences. And if we're not careful, we could be misled. The false equivalence fallacy often oversimplifies a comparison by exaggerating a shared characteristic, downplaying an important difference, or removing essential context or nuance, such as comparing things that have differing orders of magnitude. Or, in other words, comparing apples to oranges, or apples to tomatoes. For example, someone may say the government should be run like a business. Superficially, this might make sense, but importantly, a government and a business have different objectives. It's often easier to see similarities than it is to dive into the weeds and analyze how things are different. But just because they seem to share an attribute does not make them the same. So if someone makes a comparison, stop and ask yourself, are there important differences that would invalidate the conclusion? The hasty generalization fallacy draws a broad conclusion based on a small sample. Our brains are constantly using limited information to generalize. We have to, as we'll never have fully complete data for every decision. The hasty generalization occurs when we use limited evidence, often anecdotes, to make a broad claim. Armed with our evidence, we jump to a conclusion. Essentially, we assume our sample is representative of reality. But not only are our experiences limited, our biases can influence the samples we choose, resulting in a conclusion that isn't justified. A common example is stereotyping groups of people, such as kids these days are so rude, or using personal experiences like Anthony was bitten by a cat when he was young, so he concludes that all cats bite. Or it's cold outside where I am, so climate change isn't real. Generalized conclusions are always tentative, so we should avoid overconfidence and the use of exaggerated language such as all or none, always or never. And remember that the strength of a conclusion depends on our sample. Those based on larger and more representative samples are significantly stronger than those based on smaller or atypical samples. The red herring fallacy is an attempt to distract from the main issue by bringing in irrelevant information. The name comes from a story in which smelly fish were used to distract hound dogs by covering up a scent. While the story may or may not be true, it can be a helpful way to visualize how this fallacy works. The red herring fallacy is used to divert and distract. It can be difficult to recognize as the new information might seem relevant, but it's a shift towards something that's easier or safer for the party committing the fallacy. Basically, they lack a good response, so they change the subject. For example, a reporter may ask a politician, "What's your plan to address climate change?" The politician's response, "My tax cut boosted the economy," doesn't address climate change. It pulls the conversation towards something he would rather talk about. Or you ask your spouse, who brought home a new big screen TV, why they spent money without discussing it with you first. And they respond, "It was on sale." To spot a red herring, notice if the response is relevant to the original issue. This can be more challenging than it seems, and if you're not careful, you could end up miles away from where you intended. But don't get distracted. Pull the conversation back to the main issue. The single cause fallacy oversimplifies a complex and nuanced issue into one simple cause. Our brains generally prefer simple answers to complex ones, but complex issues often have many causes, and oversimplification can lead us astray. If we want to solve problems, we need to fully understand them. The single cause fallacy can take many forms, from assigning blame for a problem or giving credit for a solution. But it's fallacious because it's likely that many factors contributed to an outcome. For example, wildfires have multiple causes. Fire is a natural part of all ecosystems, but a range of human activities are increasing the frequency and intensity of the fires, among them climate change, invasive forest insects, and a century of fire suppression. Limiting ourselves to one single cause can result in not understanding and therefore not being able to address this complex and growing problem. Phrases like, the reason X happened is, or the cause of X, are indicators that someone is guilty of committing a single cause fallacy. So ask yourself, could there be more to this issue than what's being presented? The slippery slope fallacy argues that an action will lead to a chain of events, resulting in extreme and undesirable consequences. Slippery slope arguments argue against the issue at hand by diverting attention towards negative and unlikely outcomes. This fallacy is often combined with appeals to emotion, as the horrible sequence events are presented as inevitable. However, the slippery slope is fallacious because moderate positions don't necessarily lead to extreme outcomes. This example is from a fun assignment in which students use fallacies to convince their teacher why they shouldn't fail the class, despite not doing any of the work. If I fail this class, my life will spiral out of control. I'll end up homeless and have to beg for change. It'll ruin my chances of getting into medical school. So if you fail me, I'll have to live in a tent and people will die and it will all be your fault. The good news is that slippery slope arguments are easy to identify and avoid once you learn how they work. So ask yourself, how likely is it that the action at hand will lead to the outcomes that are being presented? The straw man fallacy misrepresents an opponent's argument to make it easier to dismiss. It often involves distorting, exaggerating, oversimplifying, or taking pieces out of context. In this example, person 1 says we should eat less beef because of the environmental impacts, which person 2 exaggerates and distorts to claim that person 1 wants everyone to be a vegetarian, a position that's much easier to defeat. Anti-science arguments commonly involve straw men. Why try to argue with a strongly supported scientific conclusion when you can just misrepresent it? Political arguments also often use straw men to score cheap victories. Like all fallacies, the straw man can be accidental due to a lack of understanding, or it can be purposeful, used as a cheap way to persuade and mislead. Essentially, by building a straw version of the original argument, they can more easily knock it down and claim victory. However, it's fallacious because they're attacking a position their opponent doesn't hold. So, that's it. Master these 15 common fallacies and you'll protect yourself from the most common misleading arguments. Now, at the beginning of this video, I promised you a bonus fallacy, so here it is. The fallacy. This fallacy is very meta. Basically, this is concluding that an argument is wrong because it commits a fallacy. But just because an argument is bad doesn't mean that the claim isn't true. So don't point out a fallacy to win an argument. They might have argued poorly, but that doesn't mean that you're right. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And for more critical thinking content, be sure to check out thinkingispower.com and follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.